Hello again. Good morning again, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Good morning. Nice to see familiar faces. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Michelle D. I'm the Senior Director for Partnerships and Operations at Makati Business Club. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our event on driving sustainable business transformation, harnessing technology in the era of global climate governance, green financing, and AI evolution, with green finance and policy leader Michael Sheren. I would like to acknowledge the presence of former SEC Commissioner, Mr. Epiro Luis Amatong. Good morning, sir. Thank you for being with us this morning. Before we begin, please allow me to go through our program for this morning. We'll start with Chris Ilagan, the Corporate Affairs Head of PepsiCo, who will introduce our guest speaker. Afterward, Michael will present a few slides and we will proceed with a one-on-one discussion and Q&A. The Q&A and one-on-one discussion will be led by Ian Lauron, partner and financial services leader at SGV & Company. Ian will ask first a few questions to start the dialogue, and we hope you can join in to ask your questions later afterwards. For those who have questions later, please raise your hands, and my colleagues here, Carla and Isa, will go to you with the microphone. Before we formally begin, can I invite everyone for a group photo? We'll start first with the head table, and then afterwards we'll proceed with the group photo. The group photo, our photographer Melbert will go on stage to take it. Please be seated. Just look at the camera and give your best smile. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. So to formally start the program, I would like to call on MBC member and Corporate Affairs Head of PepsiCo, Chris Ilagan, for the welcome remarks and introduction of our speaker. Chris.
Good morning, everyone. That was an efficient picture taking, wasn't it? Get everyone while they're still fresh. But thank you and good morning, and thank you for being with us today. Our event entitled Driving Sustainable Business Transformation. You know, I've noticed that there are a number of people in the room today that are from the sustainability practice in their respective organizations. It's really great to see you. With you are also some of the actual decision makers, the CEOs, chief executives, who are very much needed to actually drive this entire agenda, and it's great to see you this morning as well. In today's world, the business landscape is changing, due not only to economic pressures and geopolitical circumstances, but also to evolving global regulations and the expectation for social responsibility and environmental stewardship among corporates. What used to be nice to haves around sustainability programs, brand reputation, they're already just basic hygiene, right, for companies, simple compliance. Right, and nowadays that burden heavily falls on the shoulders of corporates, right, especially for those that may not have had that previous practice of that nice-to-have sustainability program. Rising global temperatures and increasing greenhouse gas emissions have contributed to extreme weather conditions and frequent typhoons, resulting in the loss of lives and livelihoods, especially in countries vulnerable to natural calamities like the Philippines. As such, integrating sustainability into business strategies is no longer an option, but a necessity for continuing success and resilience. We have seen as a business community how businesses affect our nation and environment. MBC has taken upon the mission to push for sustainable practices in our community through various initiatives. MBC, in partnership with the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, and its technical advisor, SGV and Company, conducted a study that aimed to identify challenges in corporate sustainability reporting and provide recommendations to public and private sectors on how they can improve this. Today, we are excited to hear global insights from our keynote speaker, Michael Sheren. Michael is a global leader in sustainable finance and governance with extensive experience in both public and private sectors. Michael spearheads initiatives to drive sustainability forward. He leads within the United Nations World Economic Forum and Cambridge University. Michael counts 25 years in the debt capital markets, where he held key positions in major financial institutions in New York and London. He served as a senior advisor at the Bank of England for nearly a decade and held leadership roles at JP Morgan Chase, among others. He also represented the United Kingdom as a co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. He is now the president of MGVX Tech, a leading green fintech group based in Singapore. MGVX is a partner of MBC member Oracle Institute, Netsuite. Together, they integrated carbon accounting tools into the Netsuite marketplace for global emissions tracking and have promoted energy efficiency in green data centers. Please join me in welcoming Michael Sheren on stage.
All right. Good morning. It's a great, great pleasure to be with all of you today. This is a type of talk I really look forward to. We've got business leaders, we have financiers, and we have policymakers. And I want to thank the club for bringing everyone together. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Oracle who have been so kind to extend it, and Isabel and the whole team here at the club for bringing us all together. This is a type of opportunity where you can bring all three of these key stakeholders together and talk about how do we transform businesses, how do we develop the policies, and how do we finance them to meet the challenges of climate change. So you've heard I, at this point, have a variety of roles within the UN, within Cambridge University, so I get the advantage of seeing what the global policy people are still doing, some of the most cutting-edge technology, as well as the climate science. Now, my wife has told me that I'm not supposed to lead with the negative stuff, but because we want to spend most of our time on, let's see if I can get this going in the right direction. Yes, we're going to spend most of our time on business transformation. I'm going to get the negative stuff out of the way really quickly. And the bottom line is, from a climate point of view, how the Earth is doing, it's bad and getting worse. This May, last one we just had, was the warmest May in recorded history. The temperatures, as you can see, are moving up. By the way, that's the only formula I'm putting in the whole slide deck, and I will make this available to you. This slide came from one of my colleagues at Cambridge, who is a scientist. He just presented this at Cambridge, but you can see within the Philippines as well, the emissions are rising fast. They're tracking exactly with the world. The temperatures, as you can see, starting at 1880, this is not an aberration. This is actually the way the world is moving. So consequently, we need to move fast. And as I said, 21 of the hottest 22 years have been in a row right here, right now. And we just came out of May, which was the warmest month of May in recorded history. Unfortunately, that world way over there on the right is the way we're heading to if we don't start responding to things. Climate events, again, I'll send out these slides, but they're happening all over the world. 10 years ago, when Mark Carney, myself, and everyone started looking at the threats to the global economy, we thought, well, transition risk was going to be the real big risk. That was going to be where technology or policy or things would be the biggest challenge for business people. But 10 years later, it's actually physical risk. You live right in the middle of typhoons. If you look at Canada, the amount of burn in their forests, flooding the week after Climate Week in New York City, the subway got flooded. Beijing flooded. Germany right now is dealing with floods. Heat in India. Every single day you turn on the news and you can see the manifestations of the physical consequences of climate change, and that translates directly into both policy and business costs, and affects everything that you do as business people and as policy people. Again, I know it's too hard to see this, but basically it talks about the flooding, the wind, the heat, and the forest fires around the world. Now, and again, it hits the entire real economy. These are your businesses here. It covers every piece of the segment, from manufacturing to electrical to fuel supplies to waste. This is an example of the UK breakdown. Again, Philippines, I've got here greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Obviously, electricity is the largest one. We'll talk a little bit about that and about how the transition can work. And again, agriculture, transport, waste working its way down. Now, see how fast I got through? That's the bad part. Yeah, so it's pretty bad, but we're going to talk about how we can start responding to it in a moment. Next is regulation and legislation. The Philippines, starting in 2009 with its Climate Change Act, and the acts that went through have been extraordinary and have been leading. And that's partially because you are in the middle of it all. But there's a lot of stuff that's going on around why climate legislation and regulation are coming in and why they're important to you, not just for your businesses, but the things that affect them. One is if you're in Asia and you export to Europe, and by the way, the same thing's going to happen in the United States. And I'll tell you, personally, it's terrible. They sent a lot of the downstream supply business to Asia and said, well, you can do it cheaper, and we don't care about negative externalities. And now all of a sudden, oh, CBAM's in place, and you need to demonstrate that if you're providing a small piece for a BMW car and it's being sent out there, that it meets a certain type of thing. So why do you care about this? Well, because you want to still keep exporting. If you want to underwrite credit risk assessments as if you're a bank, is carbon taxes in Singapore and starting in other countries. And guess what? You have to start thinking about the CapEx, the R&D that you're going to be doing for your businesses, and also for your shareholders. It's really important when you're doing your net zero calculations that you put them together in a apples for apple type of regulation. So policymakers have responded to it. And you can see around the world where all the regulations and the laws are growing very, very quickly. This is probably the one you know the most about. I spoke with an Asian insurance company not long ago, and they basically insure and reinsure cat risk around the world. And they were terrified, and by the way, they're listed both in Asia and in Europe, and they were terrified about ISSB S2, which is really quite prescriptive of saying, well, where are your risks? Where are the potential financial implications of these risks? And can you start quantifying them? And what's interesting is we're going to talk about technology in detail in a moment, but when we started talking about this, we said to run enough scenarios, you're going to need AI. And we even brought in a group out of London that specializes in quantum computing, which, by the way, you don't hear much now. Right now you're hearing about AI. The next thing you're going to be hearing about will be quantum computing. When AI is providing the scenarios and you're able to crunch those, oh, by the way, you need data centers. What do data centers use? Energy, but we'll get to that in a moment. But IFSR, SSB is going to be key to everyone. It's global and it's becoming mandatory. This is one reason. So even if you're not keen or happy or affected by climate change, you need to respond to this. Again, this is the CBAM. If you're an exporter in Asia, you need to care about this. You need to respond to this. So no matter what you think or care about climate, you have to run your businesses. Now, technology and sustainability are mega trends. And the reason they're important is because this whole discussion is a discussion around, and I'll use an economist phrase, but it's really important for central bankers and economists. It's called free-riding negative externalities, which are nothing more than a fancy word for bad stuff. And bad stuff can be pollution that leaches into your water. It can be NOx particles from diesel trucks that are lodged in your lungs and your respiratory. It can be a child labor in Bangladesh. It can be a variety of things. Unfortunately, greenhouse gases are not only a negative externality, but they're a negative externality that's basically existential to our species. People talk about saving the world. Well, the world will be fine in 5, 6, 7, 8 million years if we destroy it. But our species may not, and it may not be a very habitable planet. So the negative externalities, i.e. carbon, methane, and other greenhouse gases, are a negative externality that we have to address. I mean, ideally, it would be great if we could basically address a lot of the other negative externalities around pollution. It's a big debate in the UK right now, amount of waste, sewage waste that's being put into the water, things around plastics, things around child labor. But these negative externalities tied to greenhouse gases is something we must address. And the real discussion today will be about how can you reimagine your business models using technology to be able to internalize those negative externalities, at least the greenhouse gases ones, and still have profitable, successful, sustainable businesses. Because if you don't have technology, the status quo, the way we do things, won't do it. So we're effectively in a casino. We've got all of our money on red and red's technology. How do we rethink packaging? How do we rethink energy? How do we rethink steel? How do we rethink all of the parts of the real economy? How do we use the financial system to finance that CapEx and R&D? And how do policymakers encourage and give incentives to actually do that? So that moves us to the themes. What's great about technology, if you look on the left, that's New York City, Fifth Avenue in 1900. The little yellow circle is the only automobile on the street. 13 years later, the exact same spot on Fifth Avenue, that circle is the only horse and buggy on the street. In 13 years, we went from 99.99% horses and buggies on Fifth Avenue to almost exclusively automobiles. So if you think, oh my God, we have to do a rapid transformation that's never happened before, ta-da, we've done this before. It takes a lot, and the mobilization that went in going from a horse and buggy, and by the way, we used horses as a species for thousands of years. So this wasn't just a transformation of, it's been moving along. We had been using for transport horses for most of our existence. And in 13 years, we moved. Now, this is a great example of a variety of things. So what it shows is, as a fixed phone, electricity, washing machines, internet, as they're introduced into society and how quickly they get adapted. If you look over here, the internet, it's almost straight up. And it starts out in 1990 and whew. So again, this transformation, it's daunting, it's challenging, it takes innovation, it takes creativity, but it's not impossible. It's very possible, and you can see how we've moved. Oddly enough, there's a big lag in washing machines. I wondered what caused it in 1945. I'm assuming it was World War II. And it took an awful long time to get up to about, it looks to be somewhere around 90%. But anyway, we won't speak to the world's desire or their lack of washing machines. The internet got it put in there. So let's talk about this link between technology and sustainability. Well, I'll have to do a little bit of self-promotion here. I was graciously invited by Oracle, who's a member of the group here, and obviously I've got our company. And software is a leading piece of this, particularly when it comes to sustainability reporting. I mean, we've talked about ISSB, we've talked about CBAM, and ultimately, data is essential. Extracting data, being able to put it in a way that people can understand it, you can respond to your regulators, and there are companies around the world. The great news is, MGVX, we've got competitors everywhere. That's exactly what you want, because ultimately, those who do it well is great, but you don't want just, well, this is kind of a niche thing. This is all of our business. So it starts with, because if you can't measure something, if you don't know what your emissions are, if you don't know what your negative externalities are, and you can't quantify them and you can't put them in, you can't start making the solutions. So the great news is starting at square one, measure what you got. You need to do it for your business, and you need to do it for your regulatory obligations. So if you don't want to do it for one, definitely have to do it for the other. So you might as well start there. And the solutions that are out there for you, whether it be for us or for some of our competitors, are fantastic, and that's where it starts. Now, software will also be important in a lot of other ways. We talked a little bit about AI, about quantum computing. We'll talk about those a little bit later, but, there we go. Just before I came up here, we were talking a little bit about the energy transition. We were looking, and I think the Philippines, it's somewhere between 46 and 56% of energy comes from coal. And coal, as you know, is the dirtiest and it's the most difficult part of the energy economy that probably needs to be transitioned first. My dear friend, sitting here at the front table, I don't know if I'm quoting him directly, but we were sitting at a great meeting outside of London, senior people from all over ASEAN, and at the very end, everyone walked around and said, well, what's your big takeaway? And I said, well, Michael terrified me. He talked to me about something called a stranded asset. I'd never heard about it before. And he was a Securities and Exchange Commissioner at the time, and he was responsible for basically government financing of things. And he's going, oh my goodness, if we're financing all these coal plants now, on 30-year financing, and we have to basically shut them down in 15 or 20 years, that means my bond is pretty much worthless and everyone who's bought it. So I caused him a great amount of consternation. I hope I wasn't responsible for sending you into academia to think about this more. And we did have it's an important element. But you can see here, the biggest question around the energy transition is one, well, it's expensive, it's difficult. Well, you can see on solar, the cost per kilowatt absolutely crashing down. I mean, to be honest, it's almost free at this point. And by the way, right now, an average solar panel gives you about 26% energy efficiency. Those in the near future will be close to 40, 45. Basically, it makes you rethink energy completely. We think about grids. We think about even mini-grids. But with the amount of efficiency you're going to be getting from solar and wind, you can literally think about asset-based financing. Asset-based energy. Now, the biggest complaint goes, well, gee, there's intermittency, i.e. what happens when the sun isn't out, what happens when the wind's not there. Well, that piece of the equation is, 5 minutes left, bloody hell. But anyway, by the way, this is normally a 3-hour talk, so we're whizzing through. So, batteries and storage, and the ones that are coming online are extraordinary. One is sodium-ion batteries. As you know, sodium is salt. It's not volatile. It's extraordinarily good at retaining energy. So for this hotel, you could put a sodium-ion battery round back. You could put solar wind. You could have offshore wind coming in from a grid, and all of a sudden you've got no issue around that. And at the cost of solar and the cost of wind, and again, this is taking a look at cost per millions on electric vehicles. Another industry. Who would have thought, even 6 or 7 years ago, that General Motors and Ford would commit to being 100% electric by 2030? I'm a General Motors baby. My father worked there for 40 years. He's passed away, but if I had told him, he wouldn't believe it. He worked on some of the very first electric vehicles. But this is extraordinary. This is adaption. This is technology moving in with the real economy and changing things dramatically. And to be honest, we're just in the foothills of this. You'll look at lithium-ion batteries 10 years from now and go, boy, those are like dinosaurs. Whatever's going to replace it, whether it's solid state, whether it's fuel cells, whatever it may be, but the starting gun has gone off, the transformation has gone off. It's the equivalent of those horses and buggies and the automobile. This is a great slide. It's a bit complex, and I won't go through it, but it kind of shows where the tipping points are of moving on transformation literally by area. You can see and the grid side electricity, which is at the top, that line in the middle shows that the technology and the cost of a particular area has now become sustainable. You can do it. And you can see the areas at the bottom, which are the hardest ones, which is shipping steel, cement, are over down here. You've got a while. You need for that black thing to move over, for this to move that direction. But you can see the movement of the real economy heading in the right direction across. I'm trying to quick. Financing. That's my background. And at the end of the day, when you're trying to think about how you move your particular industry from a horse and buggy to the next generation of electric vehicles or hydrogen buses or whatever they may be, I know I'm really pleased that there's someone from the steel industry here. I've spent a decent amount of time in Sweden. I've done some talks. There's 2 green steel companies there, which is fantastic. Opportunities for transitioning cement. These are tough, and I get it. and you're not going to transition overnight, but there's opportunities there. The energy is a no-brainer. It's already there. But the thing that I want you to leave here with is the money is there on the financing side, and I can tell you unequivocally across most industry areas, the technology is there for a meaningful shift to a more sustainable. So money's there, but it ain't cheap. Now this is a little bit of unfair one. Roughly, it's a nice one. It's from Bloomberg, and they're using the MGVX numbers, and they're saying it's not quite as expensive as you think, but it's really expensive. Roughly, Asia needs about $2 trillion a year. That's roughly how much you need moving forward. Now, what this slide is trying to say, and the next one is, what you can do is take some of the money earmarked for the brown economy and shift it over. It's not like you run the two fully in parallel. You can shift over, and that's what makes it less expensive as you might think. But you still need the $2 trillion, that is. Million, that's pocket change. Trillion with a T. And again, looking at the costs, again, versus the old, and this is your swap over from the old to your new economy, costs and banking. But there's roughly $100 trillion in the debt capital markets right now available. So the money is there. The technology is there. And what it really means is having policymakers help and work with industry in setting incentives. And I hate to tell you, incentives are both carrots and sticks. It means for the R&D and the leadership in your companies to be able to understand what that next step is and try and find them. And the third element is the bankers. They need to actually get a little bit smarter too, because traditionally, and I was a banker for 30 years, so look, life is easy when you're just refinancing the same clients doing the same thing. If I'm financing commercial real estate and I've got a client and they build a new building, it's pretty much cookie cutter. Now they've got to actually be smart. We know the path of travel, which is sustainability, but all these changes, some of them are going to be winners, some of them won't. So the bankers need to get smarter on these technologies as well. So they have to change a little bit and do some capacity building. But it's there, and it's their survival as well. So I think I've just run up because this time's out. So that was it, 3 hours and 20 minutes. So the takeaway is climate's getting as bad, it's getting worse, but we've got some stuff we can deal with here that can actually move us to sustainable business models, get them financed, and move to the next era that we can actually be a sustainable Philippines and a sustainable world. Thank you very much, and I think my esteemed host is coming up in a moment.
Thank you, Michael. So that's very impressive. The 3.5 talk compressed to 20 minutes. Very impressive. Thank you, Michael. And now, may I call on our moderator, Ian Lauron, SGVN partner and the FSO leader, to join Michael on stage.
Hi, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you again. Fantastic 3-hour lecture. So, Michael, I'll do my best to really unpack the lecture. Clearly, it's a multi-dimensional topic, so please bear with me as we try to unpack it, perhaps by dimension or by lens. So, let me quickly start with the regulatory and policy lens. I'm just curious, based on what you're seeing globally, regionally, and based on your knowledge of Philippine regulations, where do we stand with respect to this evolving policy and regulations?
Actually, that's a great question. It's really impressive because I obviously did my due diligence. Having been a chairman of the G20, we followed very carefully all the regulatory work. So the Philippines has done very well. You've got, as I mentioned, the 2009 initial Climate Change Act. You've got the could be mispronouncing the Climate Act that came in that was introduced last year. It's really proactive. It requires a lot of due diligence, and it's really encouraging transformation. What will be really interesting, and I'd love to find out from the audience, how many people are starting to use that and act on that. Has it been the catalyst that the government has wanted it to be? So in terms of the actual acts and in terms of the actual regulatory, it's well ahead of a lot of the ASEAN countries. It's just simply now will the real economy act on it?
Michael, I'll put a nuance to your response. So what I'm hearing is, on the policy side, we seem to be adequate or ahead. So we shift a bit on the execution of those policies. And if I may categorize it in terms of policy relating to climate and related areas, the reporting, and also in terms of adaptation and the like. So let me just share some information for the Philippine context. Our commitment as a country is that we'll reduce our emissions footprint by 75% in 2030. And then the second is that based on our energy plan, the scenario is that by 2040, 50% of our power mix or energy mix will be renewable. What do you think of those, I would say, ambitions? And later on, as we go to the subsequent points, we look at the achievability of these targets, or where are we really as we go to the other dimensions?
Yeah, the ambitions are ambitious, but they're in line with many other countries. So you're not off piece, that it is ambitious. And I think when we unpack this about how do you actually do it, how do you marshal both the financing, how do you get the companies to start shifting, it's the execution on that. So the ambitions are ambitious, but in line. But as you said, it's really about the execution and seeing people actually start moving on it.
Okay, thanks for that. I'll move a bit to the industry part and the real economy. I like the term about marshal. So marshalling everyone. Looks like this is really going to be a whole of economy and whole of society approach. Just some facts, if I may share, Michael, at least in this part of the world for ASEAN. There are at least 5 green growth opportunities that would require $172 billion of capital expenditures, quite consistent, by the way, with what you have shared. And if I may add, the projection is that if these are achieved, it will create 30 million jobs by 2030. That's for ASEAN. And the 5 areas are in clean energy transition, circular economy models, sustainable urban development and transport models, productive and regenerative agriculture, and healthy and productive oceans, if I may emphasize. Could you talk a bit more about the technology that could change, whether in these areas or in major sectors that we have, whether that's in agriculture, energy, mobility, real estate, and consumer goods? How do you think we can, I know it's a broad question, but we can go there and be more sustainable?
There's a lot we can unpack there, but I think the first thing that you brought out, which is most important, is there's a huge amount of job opportunity here. And I think for the policymakers that are in the room, I mean, I think one of the greatest failures globally, every country I know, from the most developed to the least developed, is having a really good discussion with their population about what the transition means. Because if they understand that the policy is towards those type of industries which will create a huge amount of jobs, tremendous amount, then people start feeling better about that transition. And having that conversation is absolutely key. Because often people will know, oh my God, I'm in this industry or I'm in that industry, and I don't think this climate thing is going to work out very well for me. But if they have those conversations and they say, these are the incentives we put in place, we've had discussions with our real economy, so I think that's the first and foremost. The jobs are there. And I won't belabor this, but just a real quick example in the UK, where we're supposed to have all of our homes heated and cooled by electricity by 2040, which means basically heat pumps. And I said, well, look when I was at the Bank of England, I called up the Plumbers Association. How many plumbers do we have that are even certified to take, right now, gas boilers out? Because you have to be certified, otherwise you blow someone's house up. So you need to train plumbers just to take the old ones out. Then you need to basically hire people with enough insulation. Then you need to build a couple factories for the heat pumps. Then you have to have installed. The amount of job creation, the tax revenues on one little thing becomes really, and so if you're in the Ministry of Finance in the Philippines or in the United Kingdom, and you start thinking about where do we want to shift these areas, what are the jobs created, it actually starts getting staggering. And I'll use one other example that you brought in there, is circular economy. I was saying in the car with Jack today, if I was a young man and I wanted to be a billionaire, I would basically get involved in the circular economy. So instead of taking products like washing machines or internal combustion automobiles or combi boilers and crunching them, throwing them into large holes, or what we would do is train people in semi-skilled who would take them apart, and the copper would go there, the aluminum here, the plastic here. All of a sudden, in terms of your commodities you need for raw, and this goes right to the green steel point, ultimately you can start actually creating and reusing. So circular economy is basically taking the idea of recycling and expanding it to everything. The amount of jobs that you could create, the amount of self-reliance and security you could create in an economy, if you took that really, really seriously, and instead of taking, as you transition to electric or hydrogen cars, instead of either throwing them in holes or sending them to another third world country, if you took them apart and basically use those commodities for other things, you start unpacking all of this as a policymaker, as a real economy participant. You start recognizing the jobs and the tax opportunities in all those things you talked about are quite amazing. And even people that are in oil and gas or in coal, basically the amount of retraining to go into solar or wind is not that grand. So a little investment from the policy side or a combination of policy and private sector goes a long way for creating jobs. And having that conversation like this with your population makes people feel a lot more comfortable about a transition, and you'll get a lot more support and probably a lot less, and you can see in several countries around the world, particularly in Europe and other places, populism cropping up. And I think a lot of that's revolved around politicians not having good conversations around economic stability, future of jobs, and how a transition will go. If you don't talk about it, and you don't give them a good plan, people get worried.
Michael, I'll double down on the jobs and the business part. Earlier you talked about business models, and I picked up generally either we're talking here of a substitution or adaptation type or basis for the business model. Based on your experience seeing around the world, how do you think Philippine businesses can be incentivized to invest in, let's say, R&D efforts? I recognize earlier that you said there are already, I would say, testable or tested technologies. But could I press it a bit some more if specify it, for example, in cement or shipping or perhaps in steel? Take your pick or outside the
those are great. Those are all good things. And look, at technology and innovation never stops, never sleeps. So putting money into R&D is never money wasted. It provides innovation in areas that you never quite realize. Shipping is a great example. It's very important to the Philippines, important to Singapore, where I just came in from, and basically using hydrogen ammonia type of, or even those sodium ion batteries. Shipping can go very quickly, i.e. 10, 15 years, to a much cleaner one, but furthering that innovation is going to be absolutely key, and those are really attractive jobs, by the way, those innovation R&D ones. What's also interesting is I was told, and I don't know if I've just got great Manila karma when it comes to traffic, but I haven't seen any traffic since I've been here. I went from the airport to my hotel in 15 minutes. I could, yeah, exactly. So I was told, and I thought you guys were maybe just pulling my leg, that Manila has traffic. I go, oh. But assuming you do, the OECD did a really great piece, and I meant to send this to you, Christian, and I will send it to anyone that wants to see it. They have a subsidiary called the International Transportation Forum, and they did some work, I think about 10 years ago, and they took Lisbon as an example. And they had a lot of the traffic data out of I think it was the University of Lisbon, and they understood all the traffic patterns, and they measured it. And they said, what if we got rid of all individually owned cars in Lisbon? All we left was buses, the subway, if you wanted the bicycle, and we substituted the individually owned automobiles. So this is not even a high tax zone, just they're out. And you substitute it with effectively an Uber or a Grab type of system. They're on concessions. What would that mean? Well, they did a couple different studies on one with even internal combustion automobiles. First of all, even with those, it cuts your emissions by 40%. That's not even going electric. It's just with internal combustion 40%. The traffic almost disappeared. The amount of free space opened in an urban center, and this is only for urban centers, was extraordinary. And as I was saying to some of the folks from the University of Philippines earlier today, I would argue one of the big inhibitors is just behavioral stuff, being used to stop. So being used to jumping in your car and just being able to go, But actually, if you think about it, the costs associated with insurance, around repairing, around your kids just walked in and the dog's feet are dirty and you got to clean it. Imagine having, instead of thinking of a car as a matter of esteem in and of itself, you can have every car you need for any occasion. So if you're going to the park, you get an Uber with an SUV. If your son or daughter is going on their first big date, you let them do an electric Rolls Royce or something like that to really impress their date. I mean, if you basically imagine, instead of having, and you see this in the UK, even young people who don't have a lot of money because they put esteem in a product, even though they may not even be able to afford it, but being able to change the things that are important to us. Because as I said, the technology is there. The government could very easily do this, but there'd probably be a mass revolt in the UK because people are so in love with their cars instead of thinking about it differently. So that's more behavioral economics, but the policy, that discussion with population, telling people, and by the way, if you want a BMW electric car to pick you up every day, you can do it. It costs you a little more, but that if you want to show that to your neighbors, you still get your opportunity to do that. But imagine Manila, where all of a sudden you've dropped the amount of cars on the road by 40, 50, 60%, the amount of pollution by 40%, and that's without even changing to electric vehicles. It's astounding. So those are the types of policies, and those, this is not just some cooked up thing. I think they've then gone on and looked at Dublin and a variety of other cities. But it's something that policymakers in conjunction with industry could do. You don't have to do this for the suburbs, you don't have to do it for the countryside, but just think of all the urban centers in the world. New York, Shanghai, Singapore, all going to that. It's extraordinary, and then you can do that overnight if you wanted to.
That's quite a lot of insights there, Michael. I will open up the discussion to our audience. I'm sure we have really substantive questions or insights from our colleagues. Should I cold call Isa and Carla, please? You could help. Yes. Yes, sir.
Hi. Good morning. I'm Philip Hagedorn from ATR Asset Management. Michael, thank you. My question is maybe twofold. One is, how do we make a sustainability report as important as an annual report? Number one, because annual report has all the nice stuff Warren Buffett likes.
Yeah.
The sustainability report has no real set format.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, my second part is whether the UN Sustainable Development Goals should form the core of that format of the report, where you have a measuring stick for every goal, and not necessarily that you have to commit to every single one, but I'm wondering, we need to have a framework. I guess that's the question. How do we make it as important so that an investor, a lender, an owner puts 50% weight on each when considering?
That's a great suggestion, by the way. And most of the Sustainable Development Goals, not all of them can be converted to pure business things, but some of them can be. And actually, we've had some really detailed conversations in my role within the UN with Standard & Poor's and some of the ratings companies, because ultimately, those both for sovereign ratings as well as for corporate ratings, because we don't think a lot of that is actually being properly incorporated in. In some cases, it really helps some companies, others they don't. But I would argue fusing the two together, because sustainability should be an integral part of just the annual report, period. And I was talking to about $2 trillion worth of asset managers, and I told them, oh, by the way, everything you guys own, stocks, bonds, real estate, private equity, it's all mispriced. And it's mispriced because right now, the free-riding negative externalities, and let's just stick right now with carbon and greenhouse gases, in your stocks and bonds aren't being included into their free cash flow. So if you put into an annual report, if you're a manufacturer, and if you ran into your P&L, your COGS, cost of goods sold, and you ran a line for our projected costs if we had to pay for our carbon, and the Bank of England, the OECD, said basically it should be roughly $130 a ton by 2030. So even if you're not being taxed on it right here, right now in your jurisdiction, I would argue if I was an investor looking at your annual report, I'd want to know what that would mean for your EBITDA, your free cash flow, and your valuation, even running out for 7 years. And By the way, that means you're mispriced because you haven't done that, but I would be tracking that. It's also a really good way to start understanding what the implications are of not transitioning. So I think the Sustainable Development Goals cover a much broader swath, and I agree. Those should be in there, but I think if we're just really even being narrow around, because right now a lot of people argue that sustainable energy isn't quite as profitable, and that's partially because it's fighting with, even despite how cheap it is now, it's still fighting with one arm tied behind its back because the incumbent system isn't paying for its negative externalities. It's not paying for its carbon. Once you level that playing field, all of a sudden, excuse my language, you go, oh shit. I was reading in, I think it was FT this morning, that there's been an outflow of ESG stocks, and that's partially because it's not apples to apples, it's not oranges to oranges. The negative externalities are not being charged in the incumbent system. So, and for you as business leaders, knowing that, you're going, all right, I've got some breathing room, I need to start moving because they will be charged, they will be taxed, and there are already in some jurisdictions. So getting ahead of the game, because if you don't do that, and by the way, I would recommend any of you to do that exercise, and you see what it does to your EBITDA and your free cash flow and your valuation on a PE basis, it's staggering. So anyway, I think that's a great idea, but I think some of it should be actually integrated right here, right now. And the nice thing about the ISSB stuff is it's mandatory, it's starting to attach in there, and it's doing some of that. But that would be a great step beyond that.
Michael, Philip, could I hijack a bit the point about, the beta? It seems that it might lead to a beta, whether that's an investing company or, when you have the free cash flows, you have the valuation, by how much would there be like a climate discount or whatever discount? Or even on banks, for instance, when you have your receivables or loans, there might be a shadow probability of default. I wonder, how is it in your part of the world being manifested? I'm not looking for an elegant number, Michael, but we're just curious, especially for the likes of Philip who need to evaluate these types of companies.
No, this is key, and this even gets to our point around stranded assets, because stranded assets are generally financial assets sitting on banks' balance sheets. So ultimately, I can tell you, I can't give you the names, but I know of two very large financial institutions that were thinking of doing their own separate green bank. In the end, they chose not to, because even though that would be a very nice bank, it was still going to be fairly small in terms of their assets, which means the rest of their bank is a brown bank. And, and you know what that's the color of. And ultimately, they felt that was going to be highly, highly detrimental to their valuation when you could openly and transparently show how much of their clients they haven't been able to transition. I was saying to the table up front here, I thought there was a little bit, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy theory, but ultimately the policymakers globally didn't want to even the field up too quickly by saying, all right, we're going to put a carbon tax on everybody. So what they did is, I think, it's really unattractive, so banking industry is regulated. So if you say, well, look, we want to put pressure on the banks to understand the financial risk, and when I came into the Bank of England with Mark, he was also the head of the Financial Stability Board, which is a piece of the G20 that looks at risks within the financial system. And that's where the whole TCFD came from, all that kind of stuff, because we were trying to get the financial markets and the financial institutions understand, even though they weren't the real economy creating the footprint, the oversized footprint, they were still financing it, and ultimately we can see how financial crises escalate. I mean, all you need is that penny to drop with enough investors on certain financial institutions as we move forward over the next 5, 10, 15 years. You could have a run very quickly as that becomes more transparent. So I can't give you an exact number, but I can tell you the preponderance of most financial assets on most banks are brown. And so for the most part, that's why all these regulatory initiatives are in way to try and get them to talk to their real economy clients to say, guys, come on. We do this because you're just not going to go down yourself. You're going to take us down with you. So as I said, it's policy, it's finance, it's real economy. All three need to work together.
Philip, are you done? Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Jax. Welcome, Michael. I'm from the UK Embassy. I'm the Climate Change Attaché, so I'm pleased to be here and hearing firsthand from you this information. I guess my question is more on the regulatory space. No? Three things. Kamamatong, former Kamatong, we engaged so much with him in the past, but Philippines is the only country in Southeast Asia who does not have net zero target. And yeah, so not zero target. And UK, as you know, is pushing for a net zero development world. Second is that, as you know, Ian, you said NDC is ambitious, 75%, but 72% is conditional. So, and we know, I mean, it's not ambitious in reality, but there are technical transitional challenges, and we know why, transmissions and all that. And the Philippines third one is just recently, because we have the Clean Energy Forum just this week, we have they said, the DOE said the 20 to 30 trillion pesos need for for clean energy investment, basically. So that's the context. So my question is that in the NDC updating, or in the calculation of the NDC, which is set to be happening, and the submission is 2025, is that how the sustainability reporting of businesses, because it's a challenge, it's still a remaining challenge for me. From your perspective and from your experience in other countries, how do you bridge the businesses with the national government beyond the dialogues and workshops in accounting for their efforts to meet the target? Because sometimes, you know, if I'm the government, I mean, I don't know what probably the private sector is doing. So is there any, any advice or recommendations how you do it? The context of that is that UK is supporting the NDC updating, and we're about to do some work planning and all, but we want to really make sure that private sector businesses are involved in the process. So yeah, so just a practical example. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And by the way, you were probably far more articulate in posing a question that I was trying to answer earlier. But before I do that, I would also do a little bit of promotion for the UK government. I've traveled as representing the United Kingdom in a G20 around the world, and the UK embassies have been absolutely amazing in supporting capacity building, dialogue, and things here. And that's why I was really pleased that you were here today and asking these hard questions. And to answer your question more specifically, and I told you, every single country, even our own to a certain extent, has really failed in connecting the discussion between the government, their NDC targets, and how they're going to achieve them, because they're not going to achieve them themselves, the government. The government only has a certain amount of footprint. It's the real economy. And that dialogue, and this, by the way, is a small forum, a small example of this, but I would argue every country should be sitting down with their business leaders, their academics, and say, look, this is our target. Whether it's a full net zero or a 75%, because even that is ambitious. I mean, look at, when we get to 2025 and we're all sitting around in Brazil, that's going to be a tough time, because I think there's going to be some real moments. But the biggest failure is that discussion, and then it trickles right down to the general public, because they don't know what an NDC is. I would argue a lot of business leaders don't know what an NDC is and how they're committed to it, and the general population damn well doesn't understand it. And so unless you do some capacity building, kind of working through that they all get it, you speak to them with respect, with encouragement and innovation, that's how we get there. But I haven't seen one country yet who's done a decent job of that cascading of conversation and connecting the policymakers, the business leaders, and the general population to the NDCs, and understanding what the NDCs mean to them in their lives. Everything, and you probably remember the little girl in South London who died because of NOx particles, because of the respiratory disease. So that's bringing it down to people, what meeting your NDCs. They also, the producers of NOx particles also do carbon, but having that discussion, that's how you deliver it, and nobody has done that well.
Oh, that's a good call, Michael, but people generally don't know what NDCs are. So
that's my point.
So, okay,
yeah.
So looks like later on we'll talk about the diffusion and adoption behavior part. But Isa, there are questions on that side. Yes, please, sir.
Good morning, Adam Brain from Alamat Capital. Michael, this is a question about policy and policy impediments to the financing and capital flows that you were talking about earlier as being in abundance, which I would agree with. But from our perspective, one of the challenges is actually being able to deploy that capital to the right projects. When I was at the ASEAN Summit last year in Jakarta, a number of the speakers, including Professor Schwab, were talking about the reality is that classification of decommissioning coal-fired generation plants is actually a challenge in terms of being able to have an ESG classification on that project, and thus capital doesn't flow in the right direction. The other thing I thought was interesting about what was talked about in Jakarta, and I hope that there is a trend in the right direction that you could speak to in that regard, is that they perceived that there was an opportunity more so within ASEAN than in, say, the West or Europe and so on, in terms of creating the right policy to enable those capital flows. Would you be able to speak to that?
Yeah, and look at spot on. The policy flow is absolutely essential. I'll give one good example. The UK did, and again, policy has ebbed and flowed, but we put some incentives in place for offshore wind. Now, on a really good day, we can get almost 80–90% of our energy coming from renewables. That was not cost effective when that started, but the government made the policy so that could happen. We actually, when I joined the G20, part of the reason was because the UK's Green Bank basically provided first loss positions in a lot of stuff and crowded in private sector. So if you've got innovation, I would also say things like CapEx and R&D tax benefits are absolutely crucial. This transition isn't a nice to have, as I mentioned. If we were just trying to get from one economy to another, that's one thing. But as I pointed out from the very beginning, this is an existential threat to the species. This is not, so ultimately moving, and there's some huge vested interests in some of those existing technologies. So being able to provide government support, innovation support, is absolutely key, because I told you from the manufacturing side, I can build you a gigawatt of wind, solar, mostly hydro, anywhere in the world, a new gigawatt, cheaper than any kind of fossil fuel. I've now got battery technology that's coming online that takes care of the intermittency issues. So the real issue is, and if you ask a government, I suspect this one as well, one of the biggest areas that we've left off the table here, which is absolutely critical, is transition finance. And that is, how do you finance those brown industries that you still need for the length of time until they run off? You can't just shut everything down immediately, and that's a demand as well. So instead of doing 30-year bonds, you do 10-year bonds with real tight strings to them, i.e., and look, I used to be an investment banker, and I dealt with a lot of sub-investment grade stuff. So you would almost look at a coal plant and say, look, we'll finance you over the next 12 years. We know over that 12-year period, there'll be a 1.5 gigawatt substitution of you, so we'll be able to take you offline. We're going to finance you your senior debt at a price commensurate with your risk. So instead of LIBOR plus 200, it'll be LIBOR plus 1,200. On top of that, we understand that there's PP&E that's available here. There's real estate that the plant sits on. I can decommission and take some of the plant and recycle that, and even after the cost of cleaning the land, I've got a hard asset there. So it's taking real hard finance techniques, because you can't shut it all down. And I'm not saying shut it all down, but you price it correctly, you finance it correctly, you understand where the value sits in that, and you make sure you bring it offline as the substitution of the clean gigawatts come in place. And government can help work on shaping those policies. So even though I've been talking mostly about financing the green stuff, transitioning finance, and by the way, that's the number one fear, because look at the Philippines is almost 55% reliant on coal. You can't shut those plants off right now, but you need to have a plan to bring them offline and bring the new stuff online, and that takes a ton of coordination, and that needs both, again, finance, policy, and industry working together on that policy. But I agree with you. So specific things, credits, tax credits on R&D, CapEx, and coordination around these types of things, absolutely essential. And you can see some examples, and if I had a spare hour or two, I could give you some other examples around the world of where these incentives have worked well.
Michael, thanks for the free advice on structuring for transition finance. That looks like to be truly a tripartite arrangement. I'll reserve that as my last question. I think we still have 3 more questions, or 2 more, please. Isa, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Eric Captanco. I'm with the Macquarie Group. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on nuclear energy, especially with the new modular nuclear capabilities coming online, which is sometimes classified as clean.
Yeah, no personal problem, but it's more a cost problem with nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, its main purpose is to fill the intermittency issue with wind and solar. And because, as I mentioned, the battery and storage solutions are literally, they're coming online as we speak. And so the time period on getting even the small nuclear ones, and we're talking about those in the UK as well, and we've got several starting under construction, the cost per gigawatt is staggering on that. The timeline on building them is very long, and the overruns. So basically, it's more my issue on that is I can substitute the wind and solar, which are more efficient, cheaper, and I've got an intermittency solution. I mean, there's certainly obviously the waste one, but most of the new plants coming along, particularly the smaller ones, are less dangerous. They're less. They still have a waste issue, but not as big. But to me, it's more the cost per gigawatt, and if someone's got the spare cash to do that and wants additional capacity, but at the end of the day, if you want to get into really interesting stuff, even the fission stuff, you probably followed, there was a small breakthrough on that, and using AI and quantum, who knows, that could be 15, 20 years down the line, and you've spent, by the way, 15 to 20 years down the line is when I think we're going to get a couple of our plants physically up and going. So it's more of a time and cost issue. The other issues are there, but to me, that's the biggest issue on that, and the fact that you can substitute them now when you couldn't. Even 5, 6, 7 years ago, there weren't good storage solutions coming online where you do now.
Morning, Michael. I'm Marla Alvarez from BDO Unibank. We're the largest bank in the Philippines. Just 2 comments and a question. So first comment, really happy that you brought up having that conversation with people, with citizens, because from what I learned in Singapore, that's exactly what Lee Kuan Yew did to really power Singapore into the financial hub that it is right now. He really talked to the people, and everyone felt like they were being personally addressed, and they were being given the expectations and the challenge, and that it was up to them to live up to the challenge, and for all of them to work together to, change Singapore from formerly being a small area where they would throw immigrants, to what it is now. Second comment is, I'm happy that you talked about transition finance, because BDO has made a commitment towards that. We have an energy transition finance statement where we said we will not divest our coal plant clients for now, but we will help them transition. If they need access to finance for new technology to bring down their GHG, we will do that. If they have transition plans so that they can accelerate the closure of their plants and move into new businesses, we will do that. But at the same time, with an ecosystem approach, we will also be financing the communities that are impacted by those operations that will be transforming. Now, which leads me to my question. On transition finance, from your experience, can you talk about the viability of transition credits? When you are successfully able to transition a coal plant, for example, and the amount of GHG emissions that you're able to remove from the atmosphere can be equivalent to transition credits, how has that been implemented in other parts of the world? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. First of all, I really commend you, and it's extraordinarily important and brave, because if you're doing transition finance, you can come under quite a bit of attack from shareholders and other people. the most important thing is obviously to be very transparent about how you're doing that, saying we're doing that transition finance, but it's in a very tight structured box, kind of the way I described. It's not like, oh, well, we got to 12 years and we're supposed to hand over the PP&E. And what's interesting is some of the banks have even talked about having owned subsidiaries of theirs, almost like little mini hedge funds, which you've got people who are specialists in basically winding down businesses, because if you leave the relationship manager who's traditionally handled them, it's too almost of a close relationship. So being able to take that, it's a very business transactional one. It's truly transitional. It is tied to being substituted, but I commend you, because doing that right is absolutely essential to so many economies, and that's important. On the specific question of credits are, my goodness, one of the most controversial things, whether it's a carbon credit, offsetting credit. My personal preference, and this is just me personally, is more along just pure tax credits are probably a better way of doing it, because trying to sell a carbon credits, because at the end of the day, think of the Earth's ecosystem as a bathtub. So water coming in is new carbon, and so by the way, when you fill it up, basically at that point we've reached our carbon budget and the world's not habitable for humans. So there's stuff coming in, and then there's a little hole in the bottom, and basically stuff coming out. Most of the stuff getting absorbed is either coming from the sea or some forests, but ultimately trying to do other credits gets complicated, because even if there's been so many scandals, controversies. How do you quantify them? I think a government just straightforward doing tax credits and making it that way is much more tangible. I'm not trying to set government policies, but just simply there's a lot of discussion around how credits work, and they tend to be very difficult. I know everyone loves them because they can be traded. They're a financial product, and bankers love them. But to me, they're almost like an environmental Bitcoin. So I think the policy discussions are probably real cash on real tax benefits are probably more useful.
What I'm picking up, Michael, Marla, is that the debate on whether you use the financial instrument approach or more of a policy instrument, tax credits, that's what you're favoring, Michael, just to reconfirm.
No, I think you need the actual financial instruments. But I'm just saying there's always bridging that needs to take place, and that's often where you crowd in private sectors, so that could be first loss positions and things of that sort. No, it's a combination of them. I'm far from advocating a government takeover, but I'm just saying policy support, both for the financial industry as well as the real economy.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Yes, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Rowie Zamora. I'm from GCash. Thank you for your talk. It was very insightful. Hi, Ian. Morning. I think one of the key challenges in the earlier question that was raised is really an incentive for medium-sized and large corporates to kind of get over the inertia, right, of thinking about transitioning. So you've answered my one question I had, which is how can governments provide that incentive, right? So I guess tax incentive is a clear-cut one. I don't think we have a very clear policy that has been widely adopted yet on that. So I'm interested to find out from how you've observed it in similar economies, what were the success factors of governments in being able to implement this? So that's one. I know there have been a few attempts on carbon trading locally. I'm also curious to hear from you what we need to have in place from a policy, a framework, a financial exchange perspective to make that work for us as well. And GCash, it's a fintech, it's an e-wallet. What is the role that digital native companies, e-commerce, ride-hailing, fintechs, e-wallets, what is the role that we can play in this entire story, in this narrative? Because we're not CapEx heavy, right? We're not in that space, but we do have distribution. We have the connection to majority of the Filipinos who may be unaware about this topic, but whose behavior we can help shift, for example, to contribute to it.
No, those are all great questions, and I'll try and unpack as many of them as quickly as possible. When I was at the Bank of England, myself and Charlotte Hogg set up the first fintech accelerator within a central bank because we felt that digital was so key. Almost everybody, I mean, if you go to Africa, you go to anywhere, everyone has one of these. And so if you're talking about a just transition, being able to communicate with people, digital is really absolutely key. The other thing that's really important around digital is it helps provide transparency. So if you put into blockchain, information around the greenness of something and people can access that, that's, I worked with the International Monetary Fund on a digital green bond with tokenized green warrants. I mean, imagine that. I mean, from a bank's point of view, it's fantastic because most banks are rabbit warrens of old IT systems and acquisitions and things of that sort. If having been a banker for 30 years and been with the, but ultimately being able to cut through all of that and be able to have a smart contract because they can connect directly to SWIFT and having a blockchain which people can see. So in a very short point is yes, digitization has a huge role to play, and it's really important for that just transition because it can reach people that may not necessarily be easy to reach, but just about everybody's got a cell phone and the mediums that people are looking at and getting their information on. So that's key, and I think that's something that, again, that real businesses who are as used to digitization need to start thinking about what role that could have in there. I'm trying to think, there were two more points to your question. Help me.
Just the other incentives or the key success factors for helping governments with the incentives.
I must say, on the government side, I think the EU has done a great job. They've been pretty heavy-handed, to be quite honest. But if you're thinking about things that actually have to move an entire country or groups of countries, in the case of the EU, the Green Deal they have, which is coming out, it's been great. And they have actually figured out how to do carbon trading. So I wasn't being derogatory towards the entire carbon market. It was just more, I think, the voluntary one where it's a bit of a free-for-all is where the problems are. The European one where it's set up amongst large groups of companies where they've got their ceiling. If they go over that ceiling, then they have to purchase, and that's a closed system, and it's effectively a carbon tax more than a carbon credit. But so the EU has been great. But I would argue the biggest incentive has been really those cost drops in sustainable stuff. If you look at the United States, which is in almost a bloody civil war over, they've turned green into a political thing, but guess what? They've got more solar coming online. Texas is becoming, despite being fully red, and it's because the economics, the private sector economics of a gigawatt is so bloody cheap there. If you remember about a year and a half ago, their grid almost fell down. But at the end of the day, they're substituting it because it was ice storms. So I think there's a combination. There are some wonderful examples, EU being one of them, Singapore being another, about putting in government stuff. But it has been moderately heavy-handed, but when you're talking about this type of transition, you kind of need a little bit of that. But nothing beats low cost and the drop in being able to substitute the existing with new technology. And that's, part of the theme of this talk, that, we're going from horse and buggies really quick away from that.
Thank you, Rui. Other questions from our colleagues?
Good morning. I'm from SB Finance. It's a JV between Security Bank and Bank of UB of Thailand. So just to pursue further our discussion on financing, I think apart from availability, one other important consideration that we have is cost of that funding, right? As you mentioned, it's not cheap. Here in the Philippines, majority of the funding really comes from the banking sector. Unlike, for example, in UK, apart from the banks, there are a lot of funders, ESG-mandated funders that are available there that would somehow lower the cost of funds over there. But my question is, any thoughts or views on how we can bring those funders to come here in the Philippines in particular, make more funding available and hopefully lower the cost of funds?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question, and actually I'm kind of working on something on that right now, so I'll share it with you. Potentially we could be setting up a green private credit fund, which would be looking at directly financing green assets. So I'm looking at exactly the questions you're looking at. So how do you attract green capital? And obviously you do have your banks, which are fantastic, but there are other means of doing that because, and there's some pretty large ones. Everything from, so let's say you're trying to finance a group of investments. You can either issue your own bond, almost like a CLO does. Say, look, we want to, this is where your bond should go. You're not the commissioner anymore, but basically say, we're going to place 300 million USD equivalent into green renewable energy or credit supporting green energy for data centers, because we've been talking about that. Data centers are going to be really important, and how do you do that? And at that point, you attract people for those particular types of investment. The other way of doing it is the usual. You put cap in hand, and you talk to large sovereign wealth funds. Norges Bank out of Norway is incredible. The UAE, there's sources of that, because traditionally you think about lines of credits, but remember, banks, as you know, get their money either from other banks. Most banks don't realize it. It's basically interbank financing, overnight, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. They also have deposits, but deposits they pay interest on, and those can be pulled immediately. So there's other ways of getting lines of credit. Insurance companies, pension funds. When I was chairing the G20, we talked to the CEOs of some of the largest insurance companies and pension funds in the world, and we identified there was somewhere between 4 and 6 trillion of dry powder funds available for green investments. And if you look at the green bonds that have been issued so far, I think it took over 12 years to get barely a trillion. A trillion's a rounding error in the global debt capital markets. So there are money, so you have to go a little bit further afield. And at the end of the day, you have to demonstrate the investments are good, they're going to get their money back, that they're getting, because at the end of the day, financials are in the risk-adjusted reward business. So if you're providing, if you're looking to finance as part of a renewable energy thing, that's on the whole pretty stable. You know, ultimately your biggest risk is just in construction. Once energy's online, infrastructure, whether it's oil, gas, or coal, or whether it's wind, solar, or nuclear, once they're up and running, they're pretty stable. And if you look at the default rates and recovery rates at Moody's and Standard & Poor's, really low. So your risk-adjusted reward for that and raising money for that is going to be much easier than some of the really early startup green tech stuff that maybe she was talking about. But the adjusted reward on that is higher for those that make it. So I would suggest large institutional investors, depending on, again, what risk profile, because there are investors. I was talking, there's like $1 trillion invested in crypto right now. Now, if you were looking at the highest risk areas of energy, it's going to be in the subordinated debt and maybe the equity gap piece. And I can tell you, if you're looking at risk-adjusted reward, if I was a hedge fund, a family office, so even if you're doing high-risk stuff, I would say, look it, if I'm doing the junior mezz on a solar farm, you know, here's your return on that, and you're in crypto, I'll take that all day long, because even though it might be a private sector energy deal, nobody wants a energy, whether it be green or otherwise, to fall over. So I think it's understanding your risk profile, going further, you know, going maybe a little bit further and wider about, but once you start doing that, you build momentum. So there are pockets of money out there. It's a tough time, by the way, I can tell you unequivocally, it's a tough time to raise, but if you can demonstrate the cash flow and where it's coming from, and it's a good investment, there are places for that.
Michael, these are really good points. Traditionally, banks have the bankability or viability view when evaluating projects, so I can really hear that there's a combination of structuring or a venture type of fund, and even blended finance.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in hearing also if it's all right to share, if you are the bank, which technologies would you consider to be funded, if it's all right?
Yeah, and I think even from the banks, there's some really good structuring things that you can bring to sustainable investments. So we were talking about JETP funding in Vietnam, and right now you have to, if you've got a bank there, you have to bank it onshore. So that's not a problem. If you want to do something offshore, you do a synthetic with it. And basically the contractual payment schedule that moves offshore, but the actual physical sits onshore, and you've done a risk trading. And it's about thinking about structured products, things that were used traditionally. very risky things around CLOs and all these type of things, you can actually bring them. Credit default swaps are really things that can mitigate and bring down the cost of things. I know that there's a big American insurance company who's doing that on renewable energy when they're in the construction phase. So they've put the bridge loan on it for during construction, which is your riskiest piece of any type of infrastructure. If anything goes wrong, it's in those first 0 to 3 years, depending on how long it takes to build it. But if you can put a CDS on that, credit default swap, which is nothing more than insurance, so even in the U.S., they get really good returns on them. They're getting these, I think, around 12% in the U.S. on a renewable energy subordinated PCDS. So it's funny, it's taking all the risky stuff. My background, like I said, in banking was all the really bad stuff. This is sub-investment grade. I was a troublemaker, but the good news on that was that's where you learn the skill set, because you have to structure. You need to think outside the box. If you're just used to doing traditional corporate lending, where it's basically an undrawn line or a investment grade bond for general corporate purposes, that's not really fit for a transitioning world, because there's a lot more risk out there, a lot more structuring. So getting kind of that area of the banking, those types of products, and repurposing them for helping the transition to happen is really key.
Looks like, Michael, the key word would be structuring, at least on the financial side. And let me just end our discussion. I know our colleagues still have a lot of questions, but with the time, in the interest of time, let me end with this question, Michael. In your experience, what are examples of successful public-private collaborations? Can you cite one or two of them, and what can we learn from them? The context is that on the funding gap of $3 trillion, at least for ASEAN, in our previous estimates, 80 to 90% of this would come from a combination of government funding and private funding, and the rest would be what we call catalyzing investments coming from the multilaterals and the private equity / venture type. But maybe with the fiscal pressure on the government, so it looks like the private sector will have to work with the government. Your thoughts, please.
Exactly, but as I pointed out, the bit that the government needs to do to catalyze isn't as much as people think. And I think we had a gentleman here from Macquarie who purchased one of the best examples of a public-private thing in the United Kingdom. Basically, we had a green bank, an infrastructure green bank, which basically took the subordinated pieces or the risk area, the first risk, which then crowded in all of the UK banks on helping some of that wind infrastructure that I talked about. Then we sold it. That said, the current election, by the way, for those of you that know that we're in the midst of election, and I'm not in PERDA, you are. PERDA means you can't talk about it. I'm out of the government now, so I can. So constantly, one of the parties is talking about basically putting together a government-led green energy company, which again we'll use to catalyze public funds along with private funds. And those are good examples. And in fact, I can't tell you how many countries pulled us aside when I was in the G20 when we had that green bank, said, could you tell us about it? There were several that were built on that. And again, it's not the government paying for everything. It's just making it easy for our bankers to say, all right, there's a first risk piece on this, because offshore wind's a new idea here. So we're just starting to catalyze it, and there's a lot more risk here. And pretty much all of this transition fits, unfortunately, that risk profile. So being able to have a PPP situation where you've got that can provide that slice that allows your senior bankers to come in. But the other piece that I brought up is I think there's real opportunities. Everyone's looking at risk-adjusted reward. Everyone has different risk profiles and appetites. And I think there's a large amount of family offices and hedge funds also. So to your point, most governments, their deficits are huge. So I think even stepping into some of those first loss positions, there will be some element of private sector that can do that too, who've got the appetite for that type of risk. But it was a good example, as I said, is some of the green banks that we've seen.
And with that, colleagues, that ends the 3-hour discourse of Michael. We learned a lot. Thank you very much. We would have wanted this to be a whole day lecture, Michael.
Exactly.
So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Michael and Ian. That was a very insightful discussion. I'm sure attendees learned a lot from you both today. Before you go, may I ask you both to please stay on the stage for the photo op, but before that, we would like to present to you a simple token of appreciation. So we opted to get you a pocket square designed with the national bird of the Philippines, the Philippine eagle. It represents the nation's biodiversity and the need for sustainability and conservation efforts to protect the country's natural heritage. Okay, Ian, if we can ask also, Ian, would it be okay if you can join the photo as well? Okay, thank you. Can I request the rest of the head table to join our speakers on stage? Sorry, we'll take one more photo with the rest of the head table. Yes. Great, thank you so much. You may now proceed back to your seats.
With that, I would like to say thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. We hope that you find this session insightful and informative. Once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you for attending today's meeting on driving sustainable business transformation with Michael Sheren. Please share your comments and feedback on today's event by scanning the QR code on the screen or the one at your table. Feel free to stop by our registration table if you are interested to renew or apply for the APEC Business Travel Card. MBC is also helping NEDA conduct a survey on large businesses. This will help the government better understand how and where to direct development funds towards private sector needs. Stay up to date on MBC events, activities, and advocacies by following us on our social media pages. And lastly, we invite you to join us in our upcoming events. AMDEV third quarterly meeting on June 11, and the MBC annual meeting on July 31. Good morning to all, and we look forward to seeing you again at our future events. Thank you, everyone.